"I don't shake hands with people who can't move markets," Rebecca Whitmore said quietly, but not quietly enough, and the words floated across the polished marble floor of the Midtown Manhattan Conference Hall like a subtle shockwave that made 3 executives glance up from their phones and 2 junior analysts stop mid-step. Because the tone wasn't loud, but it carried the weight of dismissal. The kind of dismissal that didn't need volume to sting, and standing just inches away from her extended circle of investors was Marcus Ellington, dressed in a simple charcoal jacket without a visible logo, dark denim, and polished brown shoes that reflected the ceiling lights like still water. His posture relaxed, his expression calm, his hand extended for exactly 1 second longer than most people would dare before he slowly lowered it. Not embarrassed, not angry, just observant. Because Marcus Ellington had learned decades ago that silence often revealed more than confrontation, and Rebecca Whitmore had already turned away before his hand fully dropped, smiling brightly at the next investor in line, a venture capitalist from Palo Alto, greeting him warmly as if nothing had just happened, as if Marcus Ellington had simply never existed in that moment. And around them the conference buzz resumed, the hum of 1,000 conversations filling the glass-walled ballroom overlooking 6th Avenue, sunlight cutting through tall windows and landing across rows of white chairs and sleek demo booths where startups pitched artificial intelligence, cybersecurity, and financial software to investors worth billions. But Marcus remained still for a second longer, his eyes following Rebecca as she laughed politely with another group, her confidence polished, her authority unquestioned, her reputation as one of the fastest rising CEOs in enterprise tech already cemented across business magazines and morning shows. And nearby, a young analyst wearing a conference badge glanced at Marcus with curiosity, as if sensing something unusual in his calm reaction. But Marcus simply adjusted his watch, a simple steel timepiece without a recognizable brand, and stepped aside, allowing others to pass. His movements measured, controlled, deliberate, because this wasn't the first time he'd been underestimated. Not when he was 25 pitching his first investment fund in Chicago. Not when he walked into a boardroom in Atlanta wearing the same quiet confidence and watched executives assume he was support staff, and certainly not now, decades later, standing in a Manhattan conference where the average deal size hovered in the hundreds of millions. Because Marcus Ellington didn't chase introductions, he observed decisions, and Rebecca Whitmore had just made one, even if she didn't realize it yet. And as she stepped onto the small stage minutes later to present her company's expansion plans, her voice confident and steady through the microphone, Marcus took a seat near the back row, crossing one leg over the other as she outlined revenue projections, market capture strategies, and aggressive acquisition timelines, her slides glowing across a massive screen while investors nodded, impressed by her momentum, her certainty, her polished command of the room. But halfway through her presentation, her eyes briefly scanned the audience and landed on Marcus again, just for a fraction of a second, and something about his stillness seemed to linger in her mind, though she quickly moved on, finishing her pitch with applause and a promise of limited investor meetings scheduled throughout the afternoon. And as assistants began organizing private sessions, Marcus stood quietly, walking toward the exit without urgency, without expression, without looking back, while Rebecca Whitmore continued shaking hands, unaware that the one hand she refused moments earlier had already started moving something far bigger than a meeting. Marcus Ellington stepped into the corridor outside the conference hall where the noise softened into a distant murmur and the scent of polished wood replaced the buzz of ambition. His pace unhurried as he moved past banners promoting billion-dollar valuations and breakout innovation panels, his phone vibrating once in his pocket before he even reached the elevator. And when he answered, his voice remained calm, measured, almost detached, as if the moment that had just unfolded was nothing more than a routine observation. While on the other end, his executive assistant Daniel Harper spoke with quiet efficiency, asking if the meeting had gone as expected, and Marcus paused for half a second before replying that expectations were never the point, information was, and Daniel understood immediately, because he had worked with Marcus long enough to recognize the tone that meant something significant had just shifted. And as the elevator doors opened, Marcus stepped inside, joining a group of analysts discussing market forecasts, none of them recognizing the man standing beside them. And when the doors closed, Marcus pressed the lobby button and spoke softly, asking Daniel to pull the latest shareholder breakdown for Whitmore Technologies along with secondary market activity from the last 90 days. His request delivered without urgency, yet precise enough to trigger a chain of quiet actions across 3 offices in 2 different cities, and Daniel confirmed that the data would be ready within the hour. While Marcus watched the floor numbers descend, his reflection faintly visible in the brushed steel walls, his expression unchanged, because moments like these were not emotional for him. They were strategic, calculated, almost routine, and as the elevator reached the ground floor, he stepped out into the cool Manhattan air, where traffic rolled steadily along 6th Avenue and sunlight reflected off glass towers stretching into the skyline. And he walked half a block before stopping beside a black sedan waiting at the curb, the driver nodding respectfully as Marcus entered. And once seated, he glanced briefly at the skyline before speaking again, instructing Daniel to quietly reach out to 2 institutional partners who had previously expressed interest in Whitmore Technologies but hesitated due to valuation concerns, and Daniel confirmed he would begin discreet conversations immediately. While inside the conference hall, Rebecca Whitmore continued her scheduled meetings, energized by the strong reception to her presentation, her confidence reinforced by compliments and optimistic projections, unaware that several investors she expected to meet later that afternoon had just received unexpected calls. And back in the sedan, Marcus reviewed the early numbers Daniel had already forwarded, scanning ownership percentages, board composition, and convertible note timelines, his mind assembling the structure with the ease of someone who had done this dozens of times before. And as the car moved through midtown traffic, Marcus leaned back slightly, recalling the brief moment when Rebecca had turned away from his extended hand, not with anger but with clarity, because he understood that decisions made in seconds often revealed more than hours of conversation. And Daniel returned to the line minutes later, confirming that one institutional partner was willing to explore a secondary share purchase if the opportunity aligned. And Marcus responded with a simple acknowledgement, telling Daniel to proceed carefully and keep everything quiet. While the sedan turned onto Park Avenue and sunlight flickered across the dashboard, and far above, in a glass conference room, Rebecca Whitmore laughed with another investor, her day unfolding exactly as planned, unaware that somewhere below the surface, the first pieces of momentum had already begun to shift. Rebecca Whitmore stepped out of the glass conference room with the confident rhythm of someone whose schedule was fully booked and whose valuation had just climbed another few $1 million in conversation alone, her assistant trailing behind her with a tablet filled with back-to-back investor slots. And as they walked past the lounge area, where venture capitalists exchanged business cards and founders rehearsed pitches, Rebecca smiled politely while asking who was next, her tone calm but decisive, and her assistant quickly mentioned a short list of investors requesting late afternoon meetings. Yet one name caught her attention not because it stood out, but because it was missing, and she paused briefly before asking whether Marcus Ellington had requested a session, and the assistant scanned the tablet again before shaking her head, explaining that there was no request under that name. And Rebecca gave a small dismissive nod, as if confirming her earlier judgment, her confidence unchanged as she entered the next meeting, where 2 investors from Boston discussed scaling infrastructure and enterprise adoption. While outside the room, a young associate whispered to a colleague that the man who left earlier seemed familiar, but the comment faded quickly as the hallway filled with the noise of opportunity and speculation, and Rebecca continued her afternoon, her presentation repeated in shorter form, her voice polished and precise, her optimism convincing enough to draw interest from multiple funds. Yet as the hours passed, her assistant quietly noted that 2 previously confirmed investors had postponed their sessions, offering vague explanations about scheduling conflicts, and Rebecca barely reacted, accustomed to shifting calendars and last-minute adjustments. But when a third cancellation arrived 30 minutes later, her assistant hesitated before delivering the message, and Rebecca frowned slightly, not with concern but curiosity, asking whether those investors had given any specific reason, and the assistant replied that they had not, only mentioning that they would follow up after reviewing updated information, and Rebecca nodded slowly, her mind briefly scanning possibilities, market rumors, competitor movement, or perhaps nothing at all, because fluctuations like these were common in high-level fundraising. and she stepped into another meeting with a venture partner from San Francisco, maintaining the same confident tone, the same steady pace. Yet somewhere across the city, Marcus Ellington sat inside a quiet office overlooking Park Avenue, reviewing updated shareholder structures now displayed across 3 monitors, his team working silently around him, analyzing ownership percentages, liquidity windows, and convertible debt triggers, while Daniel Harper entered with fresh updates confirming that 2 institutional partners had expressed preliminary interest in acquiring secondary shares if pricing aligned. And Marcus listened without interruption, his fingers lightly resting on the desk as he absorbed each detail, before finally nodding and instructing Daniel to continue building positions quietly without attracting attention, and Daniel acknowledged the directive, leaving the room as Marcus leaned back slightly, watching the afternoon sunlight shift across the skyline. While back at the conference center, Rebecca Whitmore wrapped up her final presentation of the day, still confident, still composed, yet unaware that the quiet adjustments unfolding across spreadsheets and phone calls were beginning to form a pattern she would not recognize until it was too late. The conference hall slowly emptied as evening settled over Midtown Manhattan, and the polished floors reflected the fading glow of the city skyline. While Rebecca Whitmore walked beside her assistant reviewing the final notes from the day, her confidence still intact even as the subtle pattern of canceled meetings lingered quietly in the back of her mind. And she paused near the lounge area where a few remaining investors lingered over coffee and quiet conversations, her posture relaxed yet alert, because she had built her reputation on reading rooms and sensing shifts before they became obvious. And across the lounge, a junior venture analyst named Tyler Grant leaned toward a colleague, lowering his voice as he glanced toward Rebecca, mentioning that he was certain he had seen Marcus Ellington earlier in the day, and his colleague frowned slightly before asking if he meant the Marcus Ellington, and Tyler nodded slowly, explaining that he had once attended a private investment panel where Marcus had quietly acquired controlling stakes in 2 companies without ever appearing on stage, and the colleague looked surprised, asking whether he was certain, and Tyler admitted he could not be completely sure, but something about the calm presence and the way the man had observed the room felt familiar. And as Rebecca passed nearby, she caught fragments of the conversation, her expression neutral but her attention sharpening just slightly, because the name Marcus Ellington carried weight even in rooms where billion-dollar deals were routine, and she slowed her pace for half a second before continuing toward the exit, her assistant still summarizing the next day's schedule. But the name echoed quietly in her thoughts, and outside the building the evening air felt cooler as traffic lights reflected across the glass towers. While across town, Marcus Ellington remained in the office overlooking Park Avenue, his team still working through layered spreadsheets and ownership charts. The room quiet except for the soft tapping of keyboards and occasional updates delivered in low voices. And Daniel Harper stepped forward with new information confirming that 1 institutional partner had begun quietly purchasing secondary shares through intermediaries, keeping activity below thresholds that would trigger immediate attention. And Marcus listened carefully, his expression unchanged as he asked for projected percentages if the acquisition pace continued overnight. And Daniel replied with measured confidence that they could approach a meaningful influence level within 24 hours if the pattern held, and Marcus nodded once, acknowledging the timeline before instructing the team to maintain discretion and avoid sudden movements, because momentum worked best when unnoticed. And back near the conference center, Rebecca entered her car, glancing briefly at her phone, where another email notification appeared, this time from an investor requesting to reschedule their follow-up discussion for later in the week, and she exhaled slowly, not frustrated but curious, sensing that something subtle was shifting beneath the surface. And as her car pulled into evening traffic, she looked out at the skyline, unaware that the quiet recognition of Marcus Ellington's name had already begun to ripple through conversations that would reach her by morning. Marcus Ellington left the Park Avenue office just after 7:30 in the evening as the city transitioned into its quieter rhythm, the glow of office towers slowly dimming while taxis rolled steadily along the avenue. And he stepped into the waiting sedan without urgency, his mind already processing the numbers Daniel Harper had delivered minutes earlier, because by now the pattern was no longer theoretical. It was measurable, ownership percentages shifting quietly, secondary shares changing hands through intermediaries, and influence building one discrete transaction at a time. And as the car moved south, Marcus spoke calmly, asking Daniel to prepare a list of board members whose voting positions could be influenced if momentum continued, and Daniel confirmed he would have projections before midnight. While across the city, Rebecca Whitmore arrived at her apartment overlooking the Hudson River, her heels resting quietly on the hardwood floor. As she placed her tablet on the kitchen counter, her day still replaying in fragments. The strong presentations, the applause, the cancellations, and the brief conversation she overheard about Marcus Ellington, and she opened her laptop, scanning incoming messages, noticing that 2 investors had requested updated financial summaries overnight, which was not unusual, but the timing felt slightly off, and she leaned back in her chair, considering whether market rumors were circulating yet. Nothing appeared in her alerts, no headlines, no analyst notes, just quiet requests, and she responded professionally, instructing her team to send updated materials first thing in the morning. While back in the sedan, Marcus reviewed a new message from Daniel confirming that one institutional partner had increased their purchasing activity after market close through private agreements, and Marcus nodded slightly, his expression still calm, because he understood that influence rarely announced itself loudly. It accumulated quietly until the shift became undeniable, and as the sedan crossed through evening traffic, he reflected briefly on the moment earlier that afternoon, the extended hand, the brief pause, the dismissal, not with resentment, but with clarity, because he had seen the same decision made in different rooms over the years, and each time the outcome followed a familiar rhythm. And Daniel's voice returned again, confirming that if overnight activity continued at the current pace, they could approach a strategic threshold by morning. And Marcus responded with a simple acknowledgement, instructing the team to maintain discretion and avoid sudden spikes, because subtlety protected momentum. And meanwhile, Rebecca Whitmore checked her phone once more before stepping onto her balcony, the skyline stretching across the river, her confidence still intact, yet her instincts quietly alert, sensing movement without evidence. And inside the Park Avenue office, Marcus's team continued working, screens glowing softly in the dimmed room, calculations updating every few minutes. And just before midnight, Daniel sent one final update, confirming that the accumulated positions had already begun to attract quiet attention among a small circle of institutional analysts. And Marcus read the message without surprise, placing his phone aside as he prepared to rest, because the most significant shifts often revealed themselves not during the noise of the day, but in the silence that followed. And across the city, Rebecca Whitmore closed her laptop and turned off the lights, unaware that while she slept, the quiet momentum Marcus Ellington had set in motion was continuing to move steadily toward morning. Morning arrived quietly over Manhattan as sunlight reflected across the glass towers and the city resumed its steady rhythm. While Rebecca Whitmore stepped into her office just after 8:15, her assistant already waiting with a tablet and a stack of overnight updates. And Rebecca took her seat behind the wide glass desk overlooking the Hudson River, her posture composed yet alert, because something in the air felt different, subtle but undeniable, and her assistant began summarizing the morning schedule before pausing briefly, mentioning that 3 investors had requested urgent calls before market open, and Rebecca raised an eyebrow slightly, nodding for the first call to begin, her tone calm and professional as she greeted the first investor. Yet the conversation shifted quickly, the investor asking about long-term governance plans and shareholder flexibility, questions that felt unusually specific for an early morning call, and Rebecca answered confidently, outlining her strategy with precision. But when the call ended, she leaned back slightly, sensing a pattern forming, and within minutes her phone buzzed again with a message from her chief financial officer requesting a brief meeting regarding overnight trading activity, and Rebecca agreed immediately, her attention sharpening as the chief financial officer entered the office moments later, placing a tablet on the desk displaying early pre-market data, and Rebecca scanned the numbers, her expression still calm but focused, because the activity was not dramatic, not sudden, but consistent, secondary shares moving quietly across institutional channels. And she asked whether there was any public catalyst, and the chief financial officer shook his head, explaining that there were no announcements, no news, just quiet accumulation, and Rebecca nodded slowly, processing the information. While across town, Marcus Ellington stepped into the Park Avenue office where Daniel Harper and the team were already reviewing updated projections. The atmosphere focused but calm because the overnight activity had aligned with their expectations, and Daniel confirmed that multiple institutional partners had increased their positions quietly, bringing their collective influence closer to a meaningful threshold. And Marcus listened carefully, his expression unchanged as he reviewed the updated ownership map, his mind calculating timelines and potential responses, and he instructed the team to continue maintaining discretion while preparing for possible inquiries, because momentum often attracted attention once patterns became visible. And back in Rebecca's office, another message appeared, this time from a board member requesting a brief check-in later that morning. And Rebecca felt the subtle shift again, not alarming but unusual, and she agreed to the call, her instincts now fully engaged as she reviewed her email, noticing that 2 more investors had requested updated projections before noon, and she exhaled quietly, her confidence still steady but her curiosity growing. While across the city, Marcus glanced out the window as sunlight filled the room, the skyline calm and predictable despite the quiet movement unfolding beneath the surface. And Daniel stepped forward with one final update, confirming that their accumulated positions were beginning to attract discreet attention among institutional analysts. And Marcus nodded once, his voice calm as he instructed the team to remain patient, because the most powerful shifts often happen not in dramatic moments, but in the steady silence before recognition. And back in her office, Rebecca Whitmore leaned forward slightly, scanning the early numbers again, sensing that something had begun to move, even if she did not yet know why. The first real shift arrived at 9:23 in the morning when Rebecca Whitmore's phone buzzed with a message from her chief financial officer marked urgent, and she glanced at the screen before immediately asking him to come into her office, her posture straightening slightly as she sensed the subtle tension in his tone. And moments later, he entered carrying a tablet with updated market activity, placing it gently on her desk while explaining that several institutional purchases had appeared across multiple channels within the first hour of trading, not aggressive, not large enough individually to trigger alerts, but coordinated enough to form a pattern. And Rebecca leaned forward, studying the screen carefully, her expression still composed, but her instincts now fully engaged, because the numbers were not dramatic yet they were consistent, and she asked whether any known funds were behind the purchases. And the chief financial officer explained that most were routed through intermediaries, making the origin unclear. And Rebecca nodded slowly, absorbing the information, while her assistant knocked softly and stepped in with another update, explaining that 2 board members had requested an unscheduled call within the next hour. And Rebecca exchanged a brief glance with her chief financial officer before confirming the calls, her mind now assembling the pieces with quiet focus. While across town, Marcus Ellington sat calmly at the Park Avenue office reviewing the same market movement from the opposite perspective, Daniel Harper standing beside him with updated projections, explaining that the coordinated purchases had pushed their combined influence closer to a strategic threshold. And Marcus nodded once, his expression calm as he instructed Daniel to continue monitoring without drawing attention, because the objective was not speed but precision. And Daniel confirmed that analysts had already begun quietly discussing the activity within institutional circles, and Marcus leaned back slightly, his gaze shifting toward the skyline as sunlight reflected across the glass towers. While back in Rebecca's office, the first board call began, the tone polite but unusually direct, the board member asking about governance flexibility and potential partnership openness, questions that hinted at underlying awareness. And Rebecca answered confidently, outlining her long-term vision while maintaining her steady tone. But when the call ended, she exhaled quietly, sensing that the room she could not see was already shifting. And minutes later, her assistant returned with another message, this time from an investor who had canceled the previous day, requesting a brief conversation as soon as possible. And Rebecca agreed, her curiosity now mixed with caution. While across the city, Daniel stepped forward with another update, confirming that additional secondary shares had quietly changed hands within the last 15 minutes. And Marcus acknowledged the update with a calm nod, his voice steady as he instructed the team to remain patient, because recognition often followed accumulation. And back in Rebecca's office, her phone buzzed again, another alert, another quiet signal that something beneath the surface was moving faster than expected. And as she looked out across the Hudson River, she sensed for the first time that the subtle pattern from the previous day had grown into something she could no longer ignore, even if she still did not know who was behind it. The message that changed everything arrived at 10:12 in the morning when Rebecca Whitmore's assistant stepped into her office with a tone that was calm, but noticeably more careful than usual, holding a tablet that displayed a newly updated ownership summary. And Rebecca glanced at the screen before her eyes narrowed slightly, not in panic, but in focused recognition, because the scattered purchases from earlier had now formed a visible structure, several institutional intermediaries, accumulating positions that when combined represented a growing block of influence. And she leaned forward, asking her chief financial officer to confirm whether the purchases were connected, and he replied that while each entity appeared independent, the timing and volume suggested coordination. And Rebecca exhaled quietly, her mind moving quickly through possibilities: competitor interest, activist investors, or strategic acquisition. And just as she began outlining response options, another message appeared, this time from a board member requesting an emergency call within the next 30 minutes. And Rebecca agreed immediately, her instincts now fully alert as she prepared for the conversation. While across the city, Marcus Ellington sat in the Park Avenue office reviewing the same developments from the opposite perspective, Daniel Harper standing nearby with updated projections showing that their combined positions had crossed a meaningful threshold, enough to request influence, enough to be noticed. And Marcus nodded slowly, his expression calm as he instructed Daniel to prepare formal communication for the board, not aggressive, not confrontational, just precise and professional. And Daniel confirmed that the message would be ready within minutes. While back in Rebecca's office, the emergency board call began, the tone measured but serious, the board member explaining that unusual accumulation had drawn attention and asking whether Rebecca had initiated any strategic discussions. And Rebecca replied that she had not, her voice steady yet thoughtful, and the board member suggested monitoring closely while preparing contingency options. And as the call ended, Rebecca leaned back slightly, sensing that the quiet movement from earlier had now evolved into something structured, something deliberate. And moments later, her assistant stepped in again with another update, explaining that a formal notice had just arrived requesting a board-level discussion later that afternoon from a newly consolidated investor group. And Rebecca paused, reading the message carefully, her expression composed but her curiosity sharpened, because the request was professional yet confident, and she asked who the lead representative was. And her assistant hesitated briefly before reading the name displayed at the top of the document, Marcus Ellington, and for a fraction of a second the room felt still, Rebecca's mind returning to the previous afternoon, the extended hand, the quiet dismissal. And across town, Marcus reviewed the final draft of the communication, his tone calm as he approved the message, instructing Daniel to send it immediately. And as the email moved quietly across servers toward Rebecca Whitmore's office, Marcus leaned back slightly, the skyline steady outside the window, because the shift that began with silence had now reached recognition. The boardroom overlooking Midtown Manhattan felt quieter than usual as Rebecca Whitmore stepped inside just before 3 in the afternoon, the skyline stretching behind the glass walls while several board members appeared on large screens and 2 senior directors sat at the polished table, their expressions composed but attentive. And Rebecca took her seat, her posture calm even as the weight of the morning's developments settled into focus, because the email requesting this meeting had carried a tone that was neither aggressive nor uncertain, just confident. And moments later, the conference line chimed softly as another participant joined. And when the screen refreshed, Marcus Ellington appeared, seated in a quiet office with sunlight reflecting behind him, his expression calm, his posture relaxed. And for a brief second, Rebecca recognized him instantly, the memory of the previous afternoon returning with quiet clarity, the extended hand, the dismissal, the silence that followed. And the room remained still as Marcus greeted the board with a measured tone, thanking them for their time and briefly outlining his position as part of a consolidated investor group that had accumulated a meaningful stake over the past 24 hours. And Rebecca listened carefully, her expression composed yet attentive, as Marcus explained that his interest was not disruptive but strategic, focused on long-term governance and partnership alignment. and one of the board members asked for clarification on the accumulated percentage, and Marcus responded with precise figures that confirmed what Rebecca had already begun to suspect, the quiet movement from the morning now fully visible. And as the conversation continued, Marcus spoke with calm authority, outlining potential collaboration, suggesting operational efficiencies, and proposing a follow-up discussion to explore alignment. His tone never confrontational, never emotional, just controlled, and Rebecca finally spoke, her voice steady as she acknowledged his position and expressed openness to discussion. Yet beneath her composure, she understood the shift that had unfolded in less than a day. And as the meeting moved toward its conclusion, Marcus paused briefly before adding one final remark, his tone still calm but deliberate, explaining that he appreciated professional introductions and long-term relationships built on mutual respect. And the words settled quietly in the room, not accusatory, not dramatic, just clear, and Rebecca inclined her head slightly, understanding the message without further explanation, and when the meeting ended, the screens dimmed and the room returned to silence. Rebecca remained seated for a moment, looking out across the skyline, the momentum of the previous 24 hours now unmistakable, and minutes later her assistant entered with a message confirming that Marcus Ellington's office had requested a private follow-up meeting at her convenience, and Rebecca nodded slowly, her voice calm as she asked the assistant to confirm availability for the next morning. And across town, Marcus Ellington stepped away from the conference screen, the sunlight steady behind him as Daniel Harper approached with updated confirmations, and Marcus acknowledged them quietly, because the shift had already occurred, and sometimes the most powerful response was not confrontation but clarity delivered at the right moment.